You're listening to 89.7 FM Eastside Radio. This is Natasha and The Dialogue Show, where I interview remarkable people. Today I have a incredible woman in my studio, Jan Land, who is a broadcaster and businesswoman and has a CV and an achievement list as long as my arm, my elbow, and I think it sort of extends out into the street. Jan, thank you so much for taking the time to come down from Gordon, I believe it is, and interview with us.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Now, when I read your bio that you sent through, I got halfway through and I started to sort of have a little panic attack because I realized that in the half an hour that we have to get through what you've managed to achieve as a businesswoman, as a broadcaster, and as a woman in the industry that you've been in is quite extraordinary. So we're going to kick off and start a little bit. Obviously, you've been in the ABC, the BBC. You've touched on so many other amazing areas, launched your own business. But I'm going to take us back to when you were small, because we know that that's when the greatness is formed, and ask you a little bit about your life. Born and raised in Sydney, yes?
Born and raised in Sydney, a Sydney girl on the leafy North Shore.
And the North Shore near Chatswood gave you this, wonderful sort of Sydney upbringing with parents, siblings. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, I had one sister, in fact, considerably older than I, 17 years to be, in fact.
Second mummy.
A second mummy, that's right.
And your father was very successful, wasn't he?
He was an architect. He was director of the Public Works Department, as it was called in those days.
And your mum?
My mum was a teacher, and she loved little children, and she taught speech and singing, and she's still very well known, despite the fact that she passed away a great many years ago.
Okay. You obviously took certain elements from your upbringing. I mean, you almost had three parents. You had a brilliant father, a mother who was, in touch with your age group as you were growing up, and a marvelous sister. So what do you think those three people gave you in terms of your upbringing that has sort of cemented itself into your career?
A love of beauty, a love of art, a love of culture, a love of music particularly. So it was a fairly cultural background that I came from.
You were clever at school.
Well,
you were very clever at school. I'm going to say that for you because you're too humble to say that for us. You went to sort of selective stream schools, which is what we would refer to them today, and went to university at the age of 15.
Correct.
I mean, unheard of at the best of times. Most of us, 15 are sort of running around in, what are you, in year 9? And what are you, 9 or 10?
9 or 10, yes.
Sort of looking at boyfriends. And you went in to do?
Medicine at Sydney University.
Goodness.
Yes.
Why medicine? What at the age of 15 made you want to do medicine?
It was something I had grown up with from playing nurses and doctors. I was always the surgeon. And it was just something that I loved, and I still do to this day.
In fact, you actually said that it's one of your biggest regrets that even though you've had this incredible and very successful career, that you didn't follow through with your medicine degree.
Yes, indeed it is, Natasha, because I took off after the first year. I took a deferment. I was on a Commonwealth scholarship and I was allowed to take a deferment for what was to be 1 year to get some work experience. And I went to the ABC at that time thinking I was going to be working in the mailroom or do some menial task just to get some work experience before going back to uni.
And in fact, you did an audition.
Well, yes, I did.
You went for an interview and actually did an audition.
Yes, I did. And I ended up being Auntie Jan, comparing children's programs and the like. And of course, those days, everything was live. So you can imagine it was a fairly wonderful time to be alive and to be around what was then a very new medium.
And you were like 16. You would have been 16 years of age.
Correct, yes.
Which is quite extraordinary. I'm going to touch very briefly on the fact that during your childhood, your beautiful sister, who you loved and who was almost like a mother, unfortunately had a terrible car accident and died, and that would have impacted on you in an enormous way. Do you think some of the medicine, that the idea of healing and looking after people came from that experience?
It could have, but I think it was well and truly alive well before then, actually. So, yes, I think it was something that I just gravitated towards from very, very early days, and I can't really say what was the genesis of it. It was just something I really loved.
Now, you went off to do this interview, which will end up being an audition. I loved what you told me they got you to do. What did they get you to do in the audition?
Well, I had to appear before what I didn't know was a television camera, and I had to sing a song, and I had to play the piano, and I had to read a book, and I had to do all these strange things. And I thought, my gosh, clicking on stamps is a much bigger job than I thought.
I love that. And you got home and your mother said, "You silly girl. You went. You didn't get in. You weren't interviewed. You auditioned."
That's right.
But you got it.
I got it.
You got it.
Yes.
Which shows an incredible sense of maturity at the age of 16.
Yes, I think if just to pick up an earlier point that you made, I suppose now if I was to reflect on it, I had to grow up very quickly because when my sister and brother-in-law were killed in a very tragic car accident, I had to grow up very quickly because it was a very traumatic time for about 4 or 5 years after that.
And so I think when, my curiosity, and I keep coming back to it, is this sort of young age in a medicine degree with a lot of men, who at that time would have been quite chauvinistic in a lot of ways, I think. And you being sort of this very young person. In fact, you were one of the first. Tell us about Mensa. You were one of the first.
At the age of 8, I was asked to join Mensa, which I did for a little while, but my parents thought I was a little tad too young to be in such a big grown-up group, so I let my membership lapse.
No one really frightens you, do they?
Never.
You don't feel fear?
No, not at all.
And you have a desire to succeed that is quite extraordinary. You like you explained to me about going to, sort of the ABC and looking at the top job and asking to be in that top job. You wanted to go up to produce. You wanted to be in the tower.
I wanted to move out of on-air work. When I say the top, I meant upstairs in the inner control room, producer director type of role. So yes,
I see you in the flight the aircraft sitting up there in the sky, pushing all the buttons. So that really is what you find attractive. It's actually controlling and organizing and managing, as opposed to actually being in front of the camera or a microphone.
Yes, very much so. I have very strong organisational skills and I'm very well planned with things. So that is something I do tend to play to.
I know, because you're the only person who ever asked me where parking is before you arrive for the interview. Everyone else wings it. So during your time at the ABC, you were supposed to go back to medicine, didn't go back to medicine, took another year, and then had a fairly extraordinary experience that changed the way, and then you land up at the BBC. So let's touch on that experience.
I worked on the very first communication satellite program, and a program called Our World, which was literally, as the title suggests, a snapshot of what was happening live in the world at that time. And this just blew my mind. I thought, if a satellite could do this, if we had the opportunity to be part of the world instead of being as isolated as we here and hitherto had been in Australia, I had to learn more. But of course there was very little opportunities here at the ABC or indeed anywhere in Australia. So then I went to the Mecca of broadcasting, to the BBC, to see if I could get a job there. And I did, and I was very, very fortunate because I'd had so much experience at the ABC. I got a very high job at the BBC in transmission and had a very wonderful career learning all about satellites and working with satellites and learning all about colour television, which the UK had at that time and we didn't in Australia.
You said that going to the BBC for you was a very empowering experience because, having been at the ABC, you found it quite quite gender specific. It was an old boys club, and that was quite challenging. Whereas at the BBC, because you were in quite a high position, you were very well regarded, and therefore I love the way you described that. You said you didn't have to worry about the gender issue. You could just do your job.
That's right. And when you take that away, I don't think anyone realises just how much mind space that takes up for you when you've got all this baggage going on in your brain about, oh, I've got to be better. I've got to be better to be recognised as equal. If you put that aside and you go and do things, it's just amazing what the mind can achieve, and the body.
Does it concern you that so many years later we're still suffering under the same gender issues that you did when you started? I mean, it may have eased up, it may have become more topical, but there are still women out there who are struggling in Australia.
I agree with you totally, and I think it's a big problem. I think that people don't want to be stated as being feminists is also a situation that needs addressing. I mean, if you believe in your human race and in your body, then by being a woman, you should be a feminist. You should approve of what is being done and do everything you can to promote us.
Absolutely. You're listening to 89.7 FM, Eastside Radio. This is Natasha and The Dialogue, where I interview remarkable people. I have Jan Land on the show today, who is a broadcaster and businesswoman, and those two terms don't even really begin to describe this incredible lady. So we're at the BBC doing some phenomenal things. I mean, for you, what would you say was a total highlight of that BBC experience for you? Was there one thing that happened to you that was extraordinary?
There were just so many. I mean, I spent a week with the Beatles at their height, interviewing the Beatles, which was quite amazing, and little things like I met Enid Blyton in her latter stages of life, which was a wonderfully empowering experience, this shy little old lady, to meet her, who'd been the author of so many of my childhood favourite books. I mean, I worked with the President, I worked with the Royal Family, I worked with very senior members of government, and so it was a very empowering time.
Oh, how exciting. How very, very exciting. But you left the BBC and came back to Australia. Why?
Parental pressure, largely due to my sister. I think my parents were very lonely at the time, and I was getting continual pressure to come back. So after several years, I had to make the decision that I had to leave my life there and come back to Australia. And virtually, to be honest with you, start again at the ABC. Despite what I had achieved and what I had done at the BBC, I was put in the most lowly of positions.
Oh, really?
Yes, and had to start all over again and work my way up. And that was quite a hard time. But still, we got there in the end.
Now, you have, I always talk about an X factor that people have that makes them get up in the morning and just keep going. Because let's be honest, life can get hard.
Yes.
And it can be very difficult. And I imagine even though you had amazing jobs and a fantastic career up until this point, there were moments that would have been hard. What do you think your X factor is?
I love life and I love living. And I just have a passion for life. I just think it is the most wonderful thing. And I see beauty. I'm very spiritual. And I see a lot of beauty in nature.
You got married.
Yes.
Where did you meet your husband?
Through an old school friend, believe it or not.
And when you were at the ABC?
Yes, I was at the ABC at the time, though. We went out for 3 years, as one did in those days, before we got married.
Okay.
But yes.
Did we just move in?
He worked in property and development, but unfortunately he died a few years ago from spinal cancer. So
that's very challenging.
That was a very tough time, because he was the world's fittest person and no one ever believed. The life and soul of every party. He was just divine.
And 3 children?
I know, one child, 3 grandchildren.
Oh, she did well.
Yes.
I misunderstood that.
No.
I thought it was 3 children and 3 grandchildren. So
No.
one fantastic child and 3 grandchildren.
3 grandchildren, yes.
That you absolutely adore.
I do indeed.
Absolutely adore. Let's go back to the ABC. Now that we've touched on the fact that you actually were not only brilliant at your career, but actually managed to have a family, a relationship with a man that went on. Usually they don't last very long. A child, grandchildren. So you've actually managed to do what everyone perceives to be it all. How did you juggle all of that?
My husband was very supportive. I think that's a very important part of it. But also I was very focused and very organised, and I think that's where it came in. I mean, I can recall when my daughter was quite little and I rang the school when she was about to start and asked about after school care, and there was this very sharp intake of air And the school secretary said, "Our mothers don't work." And I said, "Well, this mother does. So we're going to have to do something about it, aren't we?"
Good on
So, but it was really interesting. My daughter desperately wanted to always have a canteen lunch, but that never happened because I was the only mother who had the time to make lunch every day. The others were too busy playing tennis and golf and going out to lunch.
How interesting.
It's really interesting when you look back.
You're back with The Dialogue and Natasha Moy interviewing Jan Land, broadcaster and businesswoman. Let's talk about the ABC and being there and the highlights for you. Let's touch on those highlights. What happened while you were there that you thought was, pivotal to the industry and also to your career?
The introduction of the domestic satellite, which I was very much involved with in those days, a company called OSAT, who later became and merged into Optus, but it was a very different company in those days. OSAT was largely a Australian satellite company. And we developed and grew and worked out the footprints for developing domestic satellite, which was no easy task, let me tell you, because of broadcast rights issues and all sorts of things. So that was a very, very big challenge. And that was a real highlight, I guess, of my career with the ABC.
Eventually, when you got to the top of the ABC, it was high as you wanted to go. You decided that you wanted to start your own business.
Correct.
And you went off and created Landspace.
Landspace Communications, that's right.
Which was apparently successful from day one.
It really was. I mean, my reputation at the ABC and the companies I'd worked with, so I had a lot of work that flowed automatically from that. And then it just, like Topsy, I guess, it just grew. I did some amazing things very quickly, like the bicentennial launch program, Australia Live, which many people will remember, a 5-hour live program that was done with Peter Feynman, with live crosses to out of space, the Mir space station, and down to the Antarctic, where we introduced digital television for the first time ever in an analogue television broadcast. So that was a very big thing to do.
The idea of running your own business, I mean, why? You've been in the BBC, you've been in the ABC, you've been in these really quite huge companies where there's a lot of recognition for, incredible work and a lot of access to great experiences, especially, if you're at the top of your game. Going into your own business, what drove you to start and want to have your own business?
I just felt I had more to give, and I think I'd reached a plateau in the ABC as the satellite manager. I felt that I had a lot more and there was a lot more out there, and I've always been regarded as a futurist, and I saw a lot of potential for digital technology, which was the forerunner for telemedicine and telehealth, telebanking, and of course Skype, which we all readily accept. And my broadcasting colleagues at the time were quite horrified because they thought that was a little like play school, going from analogue broadcast television to this very low band compressed video called digital.
Which now is our world.
Exactly.
So you are a futurist. So you have the ability to see things before they're actually going to happen and know where to move, which I think is a skill and a really great one. You actually... I said to you, we spoke about the medicine and you said it was your biggest regret. However, you've actually kept your finger in medicine to some degree or not. And you were describing how you actually taught the surgeons to work with the screen.
That's right.
Let's talk a little bit about that.
Well, I did a lot of work. I was contracted to the World Health Organization to do a lot of work in telehealth work, basically. And that took me around the world. And I was meeting up with a faculty of surgeons. And it was becoming abundantly clear, largely through research work that the WHO had done, that so much of surgery, the problem was the suturing and the actual invasion of the body itself that was causing the problem. The actual operation part was easy. So over a very boozy dinner one night, I think we talked about what happens if we could sort of make a television studio inside the body and start operating like a television studio. And that's exactly, we drew up actually on the back of a serviette.
Oh my goodness.
How we could light it, how we could inflate it with gas, and we started with the stomach and things like that and work around doing that. So we did a lot of pioneer work in that. And then I worked later on, as that developed over time, working with the surgeons in getting them to understand hand-eye coordination, in looking to the side at a monitor, remote from what they normally do of looking straight down inside the patient themselves.
It's extraordinary. It's quite it's quite. I mean, 1 minute we're on, we're 15 and at university doing medicine, and then all of a sudden we're pioneering a whole new way of operating, essentially. How old were you when you started your own business?
Oh gosh,
I knew I was going to ask a question you couldn't answer.
I would have been in my 30s. Yes,
Okay.
yes.
So you've run that business for for quite a while.
Yes, I did. I had that business for 14 years. And another highlight, which I'd be most remiss not to mention, of course, was back in the 1990s. I was asked to be on the Sydney 2000 bid team, and I travelled the world with talking to all the broadcasters and to virtually anyone who'd listened to us about our bid process for the 2000 Games, and that was quite a challenging and difficult time with the emerging technologies that were coming out in so many different areas. So that was very significant, and I wrote all the technical bid documents, which were later described as one of the winners. Samaranch said it was the best technical bid that had ever been prepared, so I feel very gratified and honoured to have been part of that.
You've been recognised in lots of different ways for the amazing things that you've done, and you've worked on very high-end products,
Yes.
From broadcasting through to the Olympics, and obviously now, and since your business, you've done quite a lot of mentoring, and you've done a lot of work with different businesses. How has that sort of set you up? But why move from what you were doing into sort of more mentoring kind of work and working with individuals?
I've always felt I wanted to give something back. I guess that was what it was all about. So in the early days of the digital transition that we were going through, I was instrumental in the service bodies that were around there for the service providers, so industry associations. I was president of the Australasian Teleconferencing Association and executive director of SPAN, the service providers industry group. So I was always one to give back in those times, and people were coming to me, I found, asking for advice. Then it became a career advice, and I just really fell into the mentoring role, I guess. It wasn't something I'd planned to do. It just happened.
And you love it.
I love it.
You still do it now
I do.
from time to time. Let's talk a little bit about what you love. What do you love, other than the beauty and all the rest of it? What do you love in terms of a leisure? What do you do from a leisure point of view that you love?
Right. Well, I mentioned yoga. I took up yoga last year, and I've become an absolute devotee. I think I could be walking around with a sandwich board for that.
You're a yogi.
I'm a yogi.
You're a yogi.
Oh,
Do you
I
have
love
the
it.
proper mat and the bits
I
and
have the
pieces?
proper mat, and I should share with you my gorgeous little 3-year-old grandson, Johnny Jackson, who back in June, he's fascinated that his grandmother is going to cool, as he calls it, because he can't say his S's, to school, and that I was learning meditation. And I said to him, Johnny, do you know what meditation is? Oh, Grandma, of course I do. He said, it's when you think with your heart and not your brain.
Oh, my goodness.
Is there a better description of meditation?
I've never heard
A 3-year-old.
That is quite extraordinary.
Mhm.
Sometimes they're so insightful,
I know,
children.
they are.
They don't have our clutter.
They don't.
They just don't have our clutter. What makes you cry?
Oh, I'm the biggest crier of all. I love brides. I have a passion for brides. I love love. I'll cry at the drop of a hat with that. I cry in sad movies. And one of my other granddaughters, who's now 5, Gypsy, was absolutely horrified a few years ago that I'd never seen Frozen. So we were about to watch the movie Frozen, and she was all of about 3 or 4 at the time, and the movie's about to start, and she jumps up in the front of the screen, very dramatic, and says, "Stop!" And everyone says, "What's the matter, Gypsy? What's the matter?" And she rushed off to get a large box of Kleenex tissues to put next to me before Frozen started. So that'll give you an indication.
Right. Oh, I love that. That's absolutely fantastic. So you're listening to 89.7 FM Eastside Radio, and I've been interviewing Jan Land, who's a broadcaster and businesswoman. We're coming towards the end of the interview, as unfortunately we always do. Now, in terms of where you're going and what you're doing with your life, I mean, do you have plans for the future?
Oh, one always has plans for the future. I mean, maybe the 10-year long-term plan mightn't be there, but certainly the short term. This year is a bit of a transition for me. I'm having a little bit of a work on me, my body and my health, hence the yoga. And I do physiotherapy. Well, I do physiotherapy, but I do hydrotherapy twice a week.
What is hydrotherapy?
Hydrotherapy is with a physiotherapist in a pool,
Okay.
doing exercises to strengthen things. I'm a bit of a bionic woman. I had a congenital hip malformation, which was only diagnosed about 25 years ago. So I've had 3 or 4 hips done, and I've had 2 pelvic reconstructions. So I have to be fairly careful with what I do, but I'm still quite
But you're so
active.
glamorous, aren't you?
Oh, I don't know about that.
Oh, you are. You're so glamorous, so tall and slim and glamorous and beautifully dressed. I'm going to ask you a very last question. Being a futurist
Mm-hmm.
and being in technology the way you have, where do you see us going from a technology point of view? I mean, if you were allowed to dream, and I were to say to you, where would the future of broadcasting be if technology was not an issue? We had it. Where do you think we're going?
I think broadcasting with a capital B is not got a very long life to live. It might be 20 years, but I don't think it's going to go much beyond that. Narrowcasting and smaller casting and social media, and I think social media will take off and become a de facto broadcaster, as indeed it is now in many ways. People have access to things so quickly these days. So I think from that perspective, broadcasting will change. My one regret, and I don't really know how to address this, is the lack of communication skills in young people, the way they're so devoted to their screens and it's got so many other implications with bullying and that sort of thing. So that's something I've really been giving a lot of thought to, of how we can get children away from this. And I don't think Pokemon Go is really quite the answer. So
It's been such a pleasure interviewing you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Natasha.
For coming in. And I feel inspired. And I think that one of the things we try and do is inspire people, and having somebody like you come into the studio and tell us about your life and what you've done is inspiring. So I'd like to say thank you very much.
Thank you, Natasha.